Deaf CEO humiliated at a blind date. Then the single dad next table signed, "You deserve better." Mara had a rule about restaurants. She always arrived 15 minutes early. Not because she was nervous, not because she was eager. She arrived early because it gave her time to do what she always had to do. Figure out where the light was best, which seat faced the door, where the server would be most likely to stand. She arrived early because, for her, walking into a crowded room and just sitting down was not really an option. There was always a small, quiet amount of work that had to happen first. She was deaf, completely deaf, born that way, and over 34 years of living in a hearing world, she had gotten very, very good at making every environment work for her before the environment had a chance to make her feel unwelcome. So she walked into Luca's Bistro on a Friday evening in October, looked around the restaurant like she was doing a very fast, very private checklist, found the best two-top near the left wall, amber light from the wall sconce, good sight line to the door, no one directly behind the seat she would give her date, and sat down. She placed her phone on the table. Her communication app was open. Her interpreter contact was saved and ready, though she rarely needed it these days. She was 34, and she had been navigating restaurants, board meetings, airport counters, hospital appointments, and government offices her entire life. She was not worried about one dinner. She ordered sparkling water from the server, a young woman with a kind face, by pointing at the menu and holding up one finger. When the server smiled and nodded and said something, Mara watched her lips carefully and caught the word right away. She smiled back. The server started to turn, then Mara touched her arm gently. She had a small folded card she kept in her wallet. She had printed 100 of them years ago, and it was one of the best things she had ever done for herself. The card read, "I am deaf. When you speak to me, please face me directly and speak at a normal pace. Thank you." She held it out. The server read it, looked up, and gave a small nod that meant she understood. Not the awkward, overcorrecting nod of someone who didn't know what to do. Just a nod, a real one. Mara liked her immediately. She looked around the restaurant while she waited. It was a nice place, not too fancy, not too casual. Exposed brick on one wall, little candles on every table, the kind of soft golden lighting that made everyone look a little more attractive than they actually were. There was a couple near the window, deep in conversation, leaning toward each other. A table of 4 women who all seemed to be celebrating something. Glasses raised, big laughs that Mara could read on their faces even without hearing the sound. A man in a gray suit eating alone with a newspaper, the old-fashioned kind, folded to the crossword. Mara noticed everything. She always had. When you couldn't rely on what people said, you learned very quickly to watch what they did. On her right, about 5 feet away, there was a man sitting alone. He had a glass of red wine and a bread basket, and the look of someone who had come to a restaurant specifically to be around other humans without actually having to talk to anyone. He was maybe late 30s, dark hair, going a little silver at the sides. He was looking at his phone, but not in the urgent way, more in the way of someone who had picked it up just to have something to do with his hands. He had a small hearing aid in his right ear. She noticed it because she always noticed. A reflex, really. Mara noticed him the way she noticed everything. Quickly, without staring, and then filed away. She pulled out her own phone and texted her sister, "I'm here, I'm sitting down, this is fine." Her sister, 3 years younger, endlessly optimistic, the reason Mara was at this restaurant on a Friday night, instead of at home with her laptop and a blanket, responded in about 4 seconds. "You're going to have a great time. He's so nice. Stop making that face." Mara typed back, "What face? You can't even see me." "I know what face you're making. You always make that face when you're about to do something you've already decided won't work." Mara put her phone face down on the table. Her sister was not wrong. She did have a face for this. She had agreed to the date because she had run out of polite ways to say no, and because, underneath the refusals, she was 34 and she was tired, and some small, quiet part of her did actually want to be surprised. She just wasn't counting on it. The truth, which she rarely said out loud, was that dating was exhausting in a way that was different for her than it was for other people. Not impossible, Not even especially sad. Just, there was always this extra layer. The moment when a new person found out she was deaf. The way their face changed. Not always badly, but always noticeably. The way she had to assess, quickly, whether they were the kind of person who would adjust, who would make the small accommodations that conversation required, who would face her when they spoke, and repeat things without making it a performance, or whether they were the kind of person who would be good about it for 15 minutes, and then slowly, gradually, comfortably forget. She had met a lot of the second kind. She watched the door. His name was Derek, and he arrived 6 minutes late. She knew it was him because her sister had shown her a photo, and because he walked into the restaurant the way some men do, like he had already decided the room was happy he was there. He was good-looking in a conventional way, tall, well-dressed, confident. He scanned the room and found her, and his expression shifted into something that was clearly positive. She caught the small adjustment, the almost smile, the little recalculation. She had been assessed and passed. She knew that look too. He slid into the seat across from her with the easy energy of someone who had never been nervous about a first date in his life. He said something immediately. She caught fragments, sorry and traffic, and possibly her name, which he said wrong. Her name was not difficult, but people often said it like they weren't sure. She turned her phone screen up and slid it slightly toward him. The app was open. She typed quickly, "Hi, I'm Mara. I'm deaf, so I lip read and use this app. Just face me when you talk, and speak normally. No need to shout or slow down a lot. Ready to have a good dinner?" He read it. He looked up. He smiled. "Yeah, of course." "Absolutely." He said it clearly, facing her, and she caught every word. Okay, she thought. Good start. He picked up the menu, and she watched him read it. He had an expressive face, raised his eyebrows at the prices, tilted his head at something, moved his lips slightly as he read, which she noted made him easy to lip read when he spoke. He was not, in those first few minutes, unkind. He was just a person, a regular, ordinary person who talked fast and had strong opinions about the pasta options and had apparently a lot to say about his week. She watched his mouth carefully and caught most of it. He'd had a frustrating day, something about a client, something about traffic again. He seemed to mention traffic a lot. He asked her what she did for work, and when she typed back, "I run a tech company. We build communication software for the deaf and hard of hearing community." He nodded in the way of someone who was not entirely sure what that meant, but wanted to seem interested. "That's cool," he said. She caught it clearly. They talked, or rather, he talked, and she responded through a combination of lip reading and typing, about work, about Seattle, about the best neighborhood for parking, about a restaurant he had been to in Rome that had the best carbonara of his life. He had traveled extensively for work. He had been to 9 countries in the last 2 years. He mentioned this in the way of someone who expected it to impress, and Mara, who had spoken at conferences on 4 continents, did not mention her own travel record. The first 15 minutes were fine, ordinary. The kind of mildly awkward, mildly interesting conversation that first dates always were. She asked him questions by typing, and he answered by talking. He'd figured out the rhythm of it quickly, which she appreciated. He kept his face toward her. He wasn't performing patience about it. He just did it. She thought, maybe my sister was right. And then his phone buzzed. She saw it, the vibration on the table, the quick glance down, the small furrow in his brow that meant it was something he felt he needed to deal with. He held up one finger, the universal sign for 1 second, and picked up his phone. She watched him type. It took a while. The server came. Mara ordered the pasta by pointing. She asked, through the app, held up for the server to see, if they could bring the bread basket. The server nodded warmly. Mara sat with her water and her phone and watched Derek finish his message and then check another one and then send another reply. It was 5 minutes, she counted. When he finally put his phone down, he had the expression of someone returning to a room he had mentally left. "Sorry," he said, clearly enough that she caught it. "Work thing." "It's fine," she typed, because it was, technically. It had happened once. She gave people once. The bread came. They ate. The conversation picked back up, but something had shifted slightly. She couldn't have said exactly what. He was still talking, more if anything. The wine had loosened him a little, made him more expansive. He was the kind of person who got more comfortable as he talked, who used conversation the way some people used movement. He was telling a long story about a trip he'd taken to Italy, and she was tracking his mouth, catching pieces. Rome, this tiny restaurant, incredible pasta, and nodding in the right places. And then he turned to signal the server and she lost the thread. When he turned back, he was already mid-sentence. She caught. Right? I mean, didn't you think so? She looked at him. She typed, "Sorry, I lost you when you turned. Can you repeat the last part?" He blinked. "Oh, right. Yeah. Sorry." He repeated it. She caught it this time. She responded. The conversation continued, but it happened again 10 minutes later, and then again after that. Each time he apologized. Each time he said, "Right, sorry," in the tone of someone who kept forgetting a small inconvenience. Not cruel, but the kind of forgetting that, when it happened enough times, stopped feeling like an accident. Mara ate her pasta. She kept her face pleasant and her posture open. She had learned, over many years and many dinners and many interactions with many people, that there were two kinds of forgetting. There was the kind where someone genuinely forgot because they were focused on something else, and as soon as they remembered, they adjusted without making it a whole thing. And there was the kind where someone forgot because they had never quite believed, in the deep down part of themselves, that it actually mattered. She was beginning to sense which kind this was. She gave him more time to show her. She was always willing to give people more time. That was not naivety. It was a choice she made deliberately, because she had learned, over and over again, that most people were not trying to be unkind. They were just not thinking. And there was a difference between someone who wasn't thinking and someone who, when you pointed out what they were doing, refused to change. She had not pointed it out yet. She was waiting to see if he noticed himself. He didn't. The thing that broke it was not dramatic. It never was. In her experience, it was never a single big moment. It was always something small, a comment, an expression, a question, that revealed what a person had been thinking underneath the polite surface the entire time. They were midway through the main course. Derek had ordered the risotto. He was talking about something. She had been watching his mouth carefully and tracking him well. And he said something, and she asked him to repeat it, because she had missed the beginning, and he repeated it, and then he leaned back with the look of someone who was about to be honest about something. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She nodded. "When my buddy set this up, he told me about you, and I looked you up, and I read about your company and all of that. Really impressive stuff, seriously." He paused. He picked up his fork, and then put it back down. I guess I didn't realize you were like." He moved his hand vaguely in the air between them. "You know, like this." She kept her expression neutral. Like what? He seemed to feel from her tone that he had stepped somewhere uncertain. He tried to recover. "I mean, deaf. Like fully deaf. I thought it might be, I don't know, more partial. With a hearing aid or something." She looked at him for a moment. She typed slowly and held the phone up. "Does that change something?" And there it was. The pause. The small recalibration she had seen 100 times in 100 different faces, in 100 different contexts. She watched it happen behind his eyes. The reassessment, the weighing, the mental arithmetic of a man deciding, in real time, what she was worth to him in light of new information. She had seen this look so many times. On dates, yes, but also in job interviews, before she was the one doing the interviewing, in meetings, early in her career, at networking events where someone would be talking to her with great enthusiasm and then find out she was deaf and recalibrate, not always unkindly, not always with bad intent, but recalibrate nonetheless. She sometimes thought that if she had $1 for every time someone's face had done that particular rearranging, she could retire. She was already successful enough to retire. She did not want to retire. I mean, I don't know. I'm just thinking about it practically, you know? Like long term. You can't hear your kids. If you had kids, you can't just have a normal conversation without all the... He gestured toward the phone on the table. She looked at the phone. Then she looked at him. "All the what?" she typed. He made a sound, not a word, just an exhale, and picked up his wine glass. "I just think it would be a lot to deal with," he said. "Long term." She sat with that for a moment. The restaurant was full. People were eating and talking and laughing around them. The candles flickered. Somewhere behind her, someone was having a birthday. She could tell by the way the mood of the room shifted, the group energy brightening, faces turning toward one table. The couple near the window were still deep in conversation, heads close together. The man with the crossword had moved on to his dessert. The world was continuing around her, completely indifferent to the fact that a man across a restaurant table had just, very casually and without quite realizing what he was doing, implied that she was a problem to be managed. She looked at Derek, who was now watching her with the expression of a man who had said something he perhaps already regretted, but was not quite ready to take back. She thought about her company. 31 employees, 3 patents, a product that had, in the past 2 years, been downloaded by over 200,000 people in 14 countries. She thought about the moment, 8 years ago, when she had sat in a tiny apartment with a laptop and an idea, and a total of $4,000 in her savings account, and she had thought, "I am going to build something," and she had. She had built something real, and good, and useful, and hers. She typed one line on her phone and held it up. "I'm going to step away for a moment." She stood up, she smoothed her jacket. She walked to the restroom with her head up, and her shoulders back and her face completely, entirely composed. Her hands, at her sides, were shaking. She stood at the sink in the restroom and looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. She had done this before. Not this exact thing, not this exact conversation, not these exact words, but this shape of experience. The version where someone saw her deafness late in the interaction, after they had already decided they liked her, and then you could actually watch them decide that it changed things. You could see the door close. And the terrible thing, the thing she had never quite gotten used to, even after all these years, was that it always surprised her a little. No matter how many times it happened, no matter how good she was at preparing herself, she ran cold water over her wrists. An old trick her mother had taught her when she was about 9 years old, after a day at school that had been harder than usual. For moments when you needed to feel something steady, cool water, running, the simplest reliable thing, she thought about the company she had built. She thought about the 3 patents that had her name on them. She thought about the conference she had spoken at in Amsterdam 2 years ago, where she had stood on a stage in front of 4,000 people and given a keynote in ASL with a live interpreter, and she had gotten a standing ovation that lasted long enough to become slightly embarrassing. She thought about the email she had received last month from a 16-year-old girl in Ohio who was deaf and who had written, through the company's contact form, to say that using Mara's app had changed how she communicated with her teachers, and that she had read about Mara in a magazine and wanted to study engineering someday. Mara had read that email 4 times. She had forwarded it to her sister with no message, just the email, and her sister had sent back a voice message that Mara could not hear but which, when auto-transcribed, read, "Mara, I'm crying in the grocery store." She looked at herself in the mirror. She thought about her sister saying, "You've built a company, Mara, you can survive a dinner." And then she dried her hands and lifted her chin and walked back out. The man at the next table had been having a very different kind of evening. His name was Eli. He was 38 years old, and he had come to Luca's Bistro on a Friday night for a very simple reason. His daughter was at a sleepover, and he had not been alone in a restaurant in a very long time, and he thought maybe it would do him good. That was it. That was the entire plan. No one to meet, no event to attend, just dinner, alone, like a person who existed in the world independently. His daughter was 7. Her name was Rosie. She was the thing that had kept him moving for the past 2 years, since her mother Diane had died. Cancer. The kind that moved fast and gave you almost no time to prepare, which Eli sometimes thought was a mercy and sometimes thought was the cruelest possible version of the thing. Diane had been 41 when the diagnosis came. She had been 41 and 3 months when she died. Eli had been 36. Rosie had been 5. He had been a structural engineer before. He had worked for a firm downtown for 11 years and had been good at it, the kind of good that came from genuinely liking the work, from finding something satisfying in the logic of load and tension and the beautiful simple fact that if you did the math right, the building stood. He had taken a leave when Diane got sick, then an extended leave, then it had just become quietly understood, by mutual unspoken agreement between him and his manager and the HR department, that he was not going back. He was Rosie's father now, full-time. It was not a small job, it was not, on most days, a sad job, but it was a job that had slowly, quietly, replaced everything else about who he was. His therapist, a calm, practical woman he had been seeing for 18 months, had told him, gently and repeatedly, that it was okay to want things for himself, that loving his daughter and being a good father did not require the erasure of every other part of him, that he was allowed to go to dinner alone, or with friends, or someday with a person he might like. Diane would want that, his therapist always said, and Eli always said, "I know," and then he went home and made Rosie's lunch for the next day and didn't think about it for another 2 weeks. But tonight Rosie was at her friend's house, the house of a classmate whose mother had kindly, firmly taken Rosie's bag from Eli at the school gate on Friday afternoon and said, "We've got her until Sunday. Go do something for yourself." So here he was, Luca's Bistro, red wine, bread basket, a table for one. He had been partially deaf for 5 years, an accident at a construction site, a piece of equipment he hadn't heard coming because of a machine running behind him, had damaged his hearing in his left ear permanently and taken about 40% of the hearing in his right. He wore a hearing aid in his right ear. Most people didn't notice it. He had adjusted, the way people adjust to things when the alternative is not adjusting. He had learned to watch faces more carefully. He had learned to ask people to repeat themselves without apologizing for it. He had, for a period, felt a grinding kind of grief about the loss. The way sounds he had never thought about were suddenly simply absent, the way certain rooms became difficult, the way music had changed, and then he had found other things to grieve that were bigger, and the hearing loss had become just part of the landscape. What the hearing loss had given him, unexpectedly, was ASL. He had learned it because of a coworker, a man named Paul, who was deaf and had been with the engineering firm for 12 years and who had quietly, consistently been excluded from the easy, casual, hallway conversation that everyone else took for granted, because most people didn't know how to talk to him and were too lazy or too embarrassed to try. The team would have lunch and Paul would sit at the end of the table and eat his sandwich while everyone else talked, and nobody seemed to notice or care, and Eli had noticed and cared and had not known what to do about it for about 6 months, and then had finally decided that the thing to do was simply to try. He had taken a basic ASL class at the community center on Tuesday evenings for 4 months. He had practiced with Paul at lunch. He had gotten reasonably good at the basics. Not fluent, nowhere near fluent, but good enough to have real conversations, good enough for Paul to one day say in ASL, with a grin, "Your grammar is terrible, but your intent is good." He had been proud of that. He had told Diane that night, and she had laughed and said, "That is the best compliment you have ever received in your life," and she was right. He thought about Diane a lot in restaurants. They had liked going to restaurants. It was one of those simple, ordinary things that had been theirs. Not fancy places usually, just good places, neighborhood places, places where the food was reliable and the staff knew you after a few visits and nobody rushed you out. They had a list: the Italian place on Pike, the Thai spot in Capitol Hill, the Frenchish bistro near the park that had closed during the pandemic and never reopened, which was a small loss he still thought about sometimes. He poured himself a second glass of wine and decided to stop thinking about Diane and look at the room instead, which was when he noticed the woman at the table to his right. He had noticed her earlier, when she came in. Hard not to. She had this way of moving through a room that was very certain, like she had already made a set of decisions about her environment and was simply executing them. He had watched her choose her seat, set her phone on the table, hand the server a small card. He had noticed the phone, the communication app open on the screen, the kind he recognized because Paul had used a similar one. He had understood, quietly, what that meant. He had watched the man arrive. Watched the early conversation. He wasn't staring. He was at the next table, and people watching was one of the things you did when you ate alone. And he had learned over years to notice things about people, because reading faces and body language had become more important when you couldn't always rely on sound. The man was fine, at first. Eli had watched him figure out the rhythm of the conversation fairly quickly. Facing her, speaking clearly. That was something. But then came the phone. The long stretches of typing while the woman sat with her water and her bread. The way the man kept turning his head mid-sentence, mid-story, mid-thought, so that the woman had to tap the table or touch his arm to bring his attention back to her face. The small, careful adjustments she made each time, not annoyed, not making a scene, just patient, in a way that looked like it had been practiced a great, weary deal. Eli recognized that particular patience. He had seen Paul exercise it 100 times. The patience of someone who had learned that making a scene about being repeatedly forgotten cost more energy than the forgetting itself. And then the man had leaned back and said something. Eli hadn't heard it. He was too far away, and the restaurant noise covered most nearby conversations, but he had seen the woman's face. Not collapse, not crumble, something much more controlled than that. The face of someone who has received a kind of news they have received before, and have a system for processing. A stillness that was not peace, but was something that had been built out of practice. And then she stood up and walked away. The man picked up his wine glass. Eli looked at the man for a moment. Then he looked at the empty seat. He broke off a piece of bread and chewed it and thought. She came back a few minutes later. He was still at his table. He had not been planning anything. He had not made any decision. He was just sitting there, finishing his wine, and when she came back across the restaurant toward her table, he found himself watching her. She was holding herself very straight. Her face was composed, but something in the particular way she was holding herself told him the way you sometimes knew things about people when you had learned to read past the surface, that the composure was work, that it was something she was doing, actively, not something that was just happening naturally. There was a word for it that he could not quite find, not fragile, not performing, something in between, like a person carrying something heavy and not letting it show in their gait. She got to her table and stood at the edge of it for a moment, looking at the top of the man's head. He was on his phone again. He hadn't noticed her return. She stood there, and in that moment, Eli made a decision. He wasn't sure, later, exactly what made him do it. It wasn't calculated. It wasn't the result of thinking it through. It was just, he saw someone standing at the edge of a table feeling invisible, and he could not sit there and pretend he hadn't seen it. He had spent 6 months pretending he hadn't seen Paul eating lunch alone at the end of the table. That was 6 months he didn't get back, and he had learned something from it. He raised his hands. He signed slowly, making sure each sign was clear. He hadn't signed in a while, not since Paul had moved to another city 18 months ago, and his hands felt a little stiff and uncertain. But the phrase he chose was simple. One of the first things Paul had ever taught him, actually, in one of their early lunch break practice sessions, back when Eli's vocabulary was barely 12 signs, and Paul had decided that the most important things to learn were gratitude, apology, and dignity. 3 words. Short signs, easy to read. You deserve better. He held the sign steady, looking directly at her, not performing it for the room, not making a show. Nobody nearby was paying attention to any of this. The restaurant was full of its own conversations. This was just for her, in the small private language that existed between 2 people across a restaurant table. Mara saw his hands go up. She went very still. It took her brain about 1 second to register what she was seeing. A man at the next table, a stranger, raising his hands and signing to her. And then her brain caught up with her eyes, and she read the signs, and she stood there and felt something happen in her chest that she didn't have an immediate word for. He signed, you deserve better. His form was not perfect. The sign for deserve, he had the hand shape slightly off, using a flat hand where it should have been more of a brushing motion across the fingertips. But it was completely, entirely legible. She understood every word. She stood there for a moment longer than she probably should have, just looking at him. He was looking back at her the way almost nobody looked at her. Not with pity, not with the particular kind of discomfort that some people got around her, like they were afraid of doing something wrong. Not with the overcorrecting cheerfulness of someone who wanted her to know they were very comfortable with her disability, thank you very much. Not with curiosity in the way of someone who found her interesting mainly as a novelty. He was just looking at her, steady, a little serious, the look of someone who had seen something and wasn't willing to act like he hadn't. She raised her hands. She signed back. You know ASL? His hands moved. A little slow, a little careful, but clean. My coworker taught me. I'm rusty. She felt her mouth move, something that was almost a smile, and then was actually a smile, though a small one. Her hands. That was not rusty. His hands, and now there was something in his face that was almost amused. I practiced that phrase just now. I only know maybe 12 signs total. That was one of them. She stared at him. You practiced it, she signed. Not a question, a statement. She needed to confirm that she had understood correctly. He nodded. Then he signed, slowly, a little awkwardly, but with complete seriousness. Yes. I wanted to get it right, and that was the thing. That one small detail. Not a grand gesture, not a speech, not a performance of allyship or understanding or any of the other things people sometimes performed when they wanted to seem like the good kind of person. Just a man who had watched something unfair happen to a stranger and had spent the few minutes she was in the restroom quietly making sure that when he said what he wanted to say, he said it correctly, so she would understand, so there would be no margin for error in the message. She stood there between the two tables, the table where Derek was still on his phone, and the table where this stranger was watching her with his hands still slightly raised, like he was ready to keep going if she wanted, and she felt something loosen in her chest, not dramatically, not in a crashing, overwhelming wave, just quietly, like a knot she had been carrying around in her sternum for the last hour, or maybe longer than that, slowly coming undone. She signed. What are the other 11? He laughed. She could tell by his face, by the way his shoulders moved. He signed, slowly, spelling out a few letters where he wasn't sure of the sign. I know hello, goodbye, thank you, please, sorry, help, yes, no, water, and he paused, and then he signed something that took him a second, his face concentrating. Beautiful. He had hesitated slightly on that last one. Like he was aware of the weight of it, in context, like he was leaving it up to her to decide what it meant, and was not going to explain it or retract it, just let it sit there in the air between them and be what it was. She looked at him for a moment. Then she signed, very simply, that is a good 12. He signed, I thought so. She signed, what is 12? He thought about it. His brow furrowed. She could see him counting. Then, you deserve better. Hello, goodbye, thank you, please, sorry, help, yes, no, water, beautiful, and, he paused, and then spelled out the letters carefully. Paul. Paul, she signed. His coworker, he signed, taught me. She thought about a man named Paul, working at an engineering firm, teaching his one willing colleague sign language over lunch breaks, and she thought, people show up for each other in ways that travel further than they know. Behind her, at her table, she was aware, without looking, that Derek had put his phone down. She could feel the changed quality of the air at the table, the slight shift that meant he had become aware that something was happening at the table next door. She turned around. Derek looked at her, then at the man at the next table, then back at her. He had the expression of someone who was trying to understand the geography of what had just happened. Mara sat back down. She picked up her phone. She typed carefully and held the screen toward him. I've had a really lovely pasta. I'm going to head out now. Thank you for coming. He blinked. Wait, what? We're in the middle of dinner. She typed. We've both finished the main course. But I thought, he sat forward slightly. Was it something I said? Because if I came across wrong, I can explain. She looked at him. She thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought about it. She could explain. She had the vocabulary and the composure, and she had, in the past, taken the time to carefully articulate to men what exactly they had said and why it had landed the way it had. She had done it with patience and precision, and what she hoped was dignity. And sometimes it helped. Sometimes the person heard her, and something shifted, and they understood, and they would say something like, "I didn't think about it that way," and mean it, and leave the conversation genuinely different, even if only a little. And sometimes they heard her and argued about whether what they had said was really that bad, and that the way she'd interpreted it was unfair, and that they hadn't meant it like that. And eventually the conversation became more about managing their discomfort with being criticized than about the thing that had actually happened. And she would leave those conversations feeling worse than when she started, which was a kind of tax she was not willing to pay tonight. She looked at Derek, and she made a quiet decision. She decided he didn't get the education tonight, not because she didn't have it in her to give, but because she had already given enough of her evening, and what was left of it was hers, and she was going to keep it. She typed one final line and held it up. "Good night, Derek. I hope your week gets better." She collected her coat from the back of her chair. She left two $20 bills on the table, more than enough for her share, and a good tip for the server, who had done nothing wrong. She stood up. She turned to the table on her right. The man, Eli, was watching. He wasn't pretending not to be. He had his wine glass in one hand, and his expression was careful and kind, and there was nothing in it that looked like he thought she needed saving, or felt sorry for her, or wanted anything from her at all. He just looked like someone who had been paying attention and was continuing to do so. She raised her hands. "Thank you." His hands. "I hope the rest of your night is better than this part." She almost smiled again. The real kind. The one she didn't plan. Her hands. "It already is." She turned and walked out of Luca's bistro into the October night. The air outside was cold and sharp, and smelled like rain that had fallen an hour ago, and was thinking about falling again. The street was lit in that amber-yellow way that city streets are at night, and there were people walking in both directions. Couples, groups of friends, a man walking a dog, two teenagers arguing about something with the cheerful intensity that only teenagers can manage. Mara stood on the pavement for a moment and breathed. She was not, she realized, as upset as she could have been. She was not shaking anymore. The knot in her chest, that had been there since Derek had said what he said, was still there, but smaller, looser. The way something feels after you have finally had a chance to put it down for a minute and straighten your back. She thought about the man at the table, the careful hands, the practiced phrase. "I only know 12 signs. That was one of them," she thought. "Who is he?" She stood there for a moment longer, and then she made a decision. She went back inside. Not to her table. Derek was still there. She could see him from the doorway, sitting with the stiff posture of a man who had been left somewhere unexpectedly and was waiting for things to make more sense. She went to the hostess stand. The hostess, a young woman who had been there when Mara arrived, and who had the particular competence of someone who had been managing restaurant chaos for long enough that nothing surprised her, looked up. Mara typed on her phone and held it out. The man sitting alone at the corner table. Dark hair, gray at the sides, small hearing aid in his right ear, red wine. "I'd like to leave him a message, please. Can you give him something from me when I've gone?" The hostess read it, looked toward the corner table, looked back at Mara. She smiled, small, warm, the smile of someone who had just understood a situation completely and approved of it, and said, clearly enough to lip-read, "Of course." Mara took the pen from the hostess stand. The hostess offered her a cocktail napkin from beneath the counter. Mara thought for a moment. Then she wrote 6 words on the napkin in her clean, clear handwriting, the handwriting of someone who had always needed their words to be easy to read at a glance. She folded the napkin twice. She handed it to the hostess. And then she walked out into the night for the second time, and this time she didn't stop on the pavement. She just kept walking, her coat pulled around her, her heels quiet on the wet street, her phone in her hand, her face tilted slightly toward the overcast Seattle sky. She felt, more than she had in a long while, like herself. Eli sat with his empty wine glass for a few minutes after she left. He had watched her walk out. He had watched Derek sit back with the expression of someone who had just been left somewhere, unexpectedly, and wasn't quite sure how to respond to it. He had watched the server come back and refill the man's water glass and clear the plate and be professional about the whole thing with the particular skill of someone who had witnessed 100 first-date disasters and understood that professionalism was the only kindness available. He thought about how she would have done exactly what he had done, except earlier. She would have said something the minute she saw what was happening. She would not have spent 5 minutes thinking about it first. She was not a person who spent 5 minutes thinking about things when the right thing was obvious. She moved toward discomfort, toward people who needed something, toward hard conversations. She said it was because she'd grown up with 4 brothers and had simply never had the option of pretending she hadn't noticed things, because her brothers would have noticed immediately and called her out. Eli had always needed a little more time. He was a thinker, a measurer, the kind of person who calculated load-bearing capacity before committing to anything structural. He had sometimes frustrated Diane with it. Not often, she was patient, but sometimes, when he would sit and watch a situation develop for longer than she thought was necessary. But tonight, he thought, he had not waited too long. He had done the thing, and the thing, those 3 signs, the practiced phrase, the looking at her without looking away, had mattered. He had seen it matter. He had seen something change in her face when she read the signs, some small release of tension that had been held very carefully in place. He was glad he had practiced. He was glad he had not rushed the signs and gotten them wrong. He had not wanted to get them wrong. He sat with the gladness for a moment. He had not realized, until this moment, how much he had needed to see something go right. How much the last 2 years had been a long, slow, quiet series of things that just had to be gotten through. The grief, the adjustment, the new shape of every single day, the rebuilding of a life that didn't look like the one he'd planned, and how much he had started to feel, without quite naming it, like he was just enduring. Just continuing, keeping the engine running, not living. This had felt, in a small way, like living. He asked for the check. He left a generous tip for the server. She had handled all of it with grace, the whole complicated evening at the neighboring table, and he appreciated competence. He put on his coat. He was almost to the door when the hostess touched his arm and held out a folded napkin. "The woman who was sitting at the corner table asked me to give you this," she said, and Eli caught enough of it to understand. He took the napkin. He waited until he was outside to open it. The handwriting was precise and clear, the kind of handwriting of someone who had always needed their words to be readable at a glance. It said, "Teach me your 12 signs. Mara NDL that. A phone number." He read it twice. He read it a third time. He stood on the pavement outside Luca's bistro in the October night, the rain starting up again very gently, not heavy, just a mist that you felt more than you saw, and he folded the napkin once along its crease and put it in his jacket pocket, against his chest. He walked to his car. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine. The rain made soft sounds on the windshield. The city moved around him in its ordinary Friday night way. He had come to this restaurant tonight to remember who he was before grief had narrowed him down to just a father, just a person in recovery from loss, just someone getting through. He had not come expecting anything else. He had come expecting, if he was honest, a quiet meal, a glass of wine, a few hours of being around other humans, and then home. He had gotten that. And something else. He started the car. He drove home through rain-wet Seattle streets. He made himself a cup of tea he didn't really want and sat at the kitchen table for a while, listening to the quiet of the house, which tonight felt less like absence and more like space, like room, like the house was breathing. He did not text her that night. He wanted to think about it first. He put the napkin on the kitchen counter where he could see it. Mara told her sister about the date on Saturday morning, over a video call. She told most of it. She told the part about Derek and what he had said, because her sister had set this up and deserved to know what had happened, and also deserved to feel slightly guilty about it, which she did, immediately and vocally and at length. Her sister's face went through several stages in quick succession: confusion, then dawning understanding, then a kind of mortified horror that Mara found, despite herself, faintly satisfying. "I'm so sorry," her sister signed. "I had no idea he was like that. He seemed normal." "He's my co-worker's cousin's." She pressed her hands over her face. "I'm so sorry, Mara." "Stop," Mara signed. "It's fine. It wasn't the first time something like that has happened, and it won't be the last. That's not the reassuring thing you think it is." "I know." Her sister studied her for a moment through the screen. Her sister was very good at reading her, which Mara found irritating and deeply comforting in roughly equal measure. "You seem okay though, like actually okay. Not the face." "I don't have the face," Mara signed. "You definitely had the face when I first asked about Derek. Now you don't." Mara was quiet for a second. "Something else happened," she signed. She told that part too. The man at the next table, the small hearing aid in his ear, the hands going up, the 12 signs, the practiced phrase, the napkin. Her sister was quiet for a long time after Mara finished, long enough that Mara wondered if the connection had frozen. Then she signed. "He practiced it? He actually sat there and practiced the sign because he wanted to get it right?" "Yes." More quiet. Her sister was making a face that Mara recognized, the face of someone trying very hard not to overreact about something they very much wanted to overreact about. Then she signed, "Mara." "I know. Did you text him?" "Not yet." "Why not?" Mara thought about it. "I don't know. I wanted to think about it first." Her sister gave her a look that required no language at all. It was a look that said, "Mara Chen, you have run a company, testified before Congress, spoken at an international conference, and you are telling me you cannot send a text message." "I know," Mara signed again. On Sunday she went to the office. She did this sometimes on weekends, not because she was a workaholic, but because the office on a Sunday was quiet and bright, and hers in a way it wasn't during the week, when it was full of the 31 people she employed, and all the productive noise that came with them. She liked the office on Sundays. She liked it when it was just her, and the plants, and the whiteboard still covered in the previous week's thinking. She sat at her desk and opened her laptop. She had 3 patent applications to review, 1 investor call to prepare for, and a product brief that needed to be rewritten from the ground up because the original draft had gotten away from the core idea in the way that first drafts sometimes did. She opened the patent applications. She read the first paragraph of the first one. She closed it. She opened a browser tab and typed ASL Signs for Beginners list. She spent 45 minutes going through a beginner ASL website, clicking through signs, watching the short video clips. "Hello, goodbye, thank you, please, sorry, help, yes, no, water, beautiful." The site had little quizzes and she took 2 of them, which was mildly embarrassing given that she had been using ASL her entire life. But she was curious what the site considered a core beginner vocabulary, and whether the site was well made. It was, mostly. The instructor was clear. She made a mental note to look up whether the instructor was someone in the deaf community, because she had strong opinions about who should be profiting from ASL education. She looked at the 12 signs the site listed. She thought about a man at a restaurant table practicing a phrase he had learned from a coworker, wanting to get it right. She closed the browser tab. She sat for a moment. She opened her phone. She scrolled to the number she had manually entered from the napkin the night before. She had been very sure she would lose the napkin. And she had been right. It had already migrated to the pocket of a jacket she didn't wear often. And she looked at the contact she had named. Simply, Table 7. She stared at it. She put the phone face down on her desk and went back to the patent applications. She got through 2 of them. On Sunday evening, Eli sat on the kitchen floor doing a puzzle with Rosie. The puzzle was 500 pieces and depicted an underwater scene, lots of blue gradient, which Rosie had grandly announced was going to be the hard part, with the confidence of someone who had not yet done any of it. The hard part was indeed hard. Eli was working on a particularly inscrutable stretch of dark ocean floor. Rosie had sorted all the fish pieces into their own pile, and was now working on the coral, with considerable satisfaction and narrating her organizational system in great detail, which was one of her favorite things to do. "Daddy," Rosie said, fitting a piece of coral into place with a small sound of victory. "Do you know that fish can feel lonely?" "I didn't know that," Eli said. "They can, especially if they're alone in a big tank. They need other fish." She looked at him with the directness that he had loved about her since she was about 2 years old. She had always looked at things directly. He had no idea where she got it from. Not from him. He didn't think, and Diane had said it had not been from her either. Some children just arrived that way. "Is that why you went to dinner by yourself on Friday? Because you were lonely?" Eli considered the puzzle piece in his hand. "Kind of," he said. "But also just because I wanted to have dinner." "Did you talk to anyone?" "I did, actually." She looked up. Rosie had his eyes. Dark brown, a little too serious for a 7-year-old. The eyes of someone who was paying more attention than you expected. "Who?" "A woman at the table next to me." "Was she nice?" He thought about it. "Yes, she was." "What did you talk about?" Eli set down his puzzle piece. "She's deaf, and I know a little sign language, so we talked using our hands." Rosie stared at him. Her expression was the one she wore when something had landed in the category of the most interesting thing she had ever heard, which was a category she updated regularly. "You talked with your hands? Like the hand alphabet we learned at school for the letter chart?" "Similar, but more than letters. It's called ASL, American Sign Language. It's a whole language, not just letters, but words, whole ideas. A lot of deaf people use it as their main language." "Can you teach me? I only know 12 signs." She put down the coral piece. "Teach me 12 signs." So he did. He sat on the kitchen floor with the puzzle half finished around them, and Rosie's absolute, undivided attention, and he taught her the 12 signs he knew. "Hello, goodbye, thank you, please, sorry, help, yes, no, water, beautiful." And the last two, you and better, and then how they combined. Rosie practiced each one with tremendous seriousness, making him show her again when she wasn't sure, correcting her own hand shape until it matched his. She was very good at it. Children usually were. Something about the way young brains worked, the same way she had picked up a few words of Spanish from her school friends and was already using them naturally in sentences. When they got to "You deserve better," Eli showed her slowly how the 3 signs connected. "You deserve better," Rosie said, making the signs. She practiced it twice. "What does that mean? Like, who did you say that to?" "The woman I was talking to. Something unfair happened to her at dinner, and I wanted her to know that I saw it." Rosie processed this. She had a way of processing information that was visible. You could actually see her turning it over. "Did it help?" "I think so, a little." She nodded gravely, like she was filing this away. Then, with the transparent directness she had apparently been born with, "Did she give you her number?" He was quiet for a beat. "She left me a note." Rosie's expression went from interested to electric in approximately 1 second. "Daddy, what did it say?" He picked up a puzzle piece and looked at it. "She wants me to teach her my 12 signs." Rosie looked at him for a long moment. Then she signed, slowly, with great deliberate care, the signs fresh from the last 10 minutes of practice. "Thank you." "What's that for?" he asked. "For teaching me." A pause. "And also for talking to her. And also," she picked up her coral piece again, very casual, not looking at him. "You should text her." He laughed. He didn't always laugh, these days. Not genuine surprise laughs, the kind that came from somewhere that wasn't planned, the kind that arrived before you could organize your face. "Maybe," he said. She looked at him. "All right," he said. He texted her on Sunday night, after Rosie was in bed. He sat at the kitchen table with the napkin in front of him. He had moved it from the kitchen counter to a book, to the windowsill, to the kitchen table over the course of the day, keeping it in sight without being able to explain to himself exactly why. And he typed a message. He deleted it. He typed another one. He deleted that, too. He sat for a while with his phone in his hand, feeling slightly ridiculous. He was 38 years old. He had a daughter. He had renovated a bathroom. He had once convinced a city planning committee to change the structural specifications on a bridge. He was not someone who deleted text messages because he couldn't find the right words. He typed, "I looked up the other 11 signs. I'm practicing. Eli. He stared at it. It was honest. It was the thing he actually wanted to say. It told her he had been thinking about the conversation. It left the door open without demanding she walk through it. He sent it. He put his phone face down on the table and went and stood at the kitchen sink and looked out at the dark backyard for a while. The rain had stopped. The yard was quiet and damp, and the outdoor light was casting a yellow circle on the wet grass. There was a small plant on the windowsill that Rosie had grown from a seed in class and brought home in a plastic cup, carefully, on the bus, holding it in both hands. She had named it Gerald. Gerald was currently leaning toward the window in the particular optimistic way of plants. His phone buzzed. He picked it up. Her reply had come in 4 minutes. Good. You still owe me 11 more. Mara. He read it. He read it again. He sat back down at the kitchen table and was aware, distantly, that he was smiling. Not the polite kind. The real kind. He typed, "Fair warning. My grammar is apparently terrible. My former coworker told me my intent was good, though. 4 minutes. That is an extremely good review. Better than 5 stars. Intent is the whole thing." He typed, "My daughter just learned all 12 signs. She's 7. She learned them in about 6 minutes and is already better at them than I am." This time the reply took 8 minutes. He imagined her laughing and hoped he was right. 7-year-olds are always better than their parents at languages. It's one of the most reliable facts about being human. It's very sweet that you taught her. What's her name? He typed, "Rosie. She wants to learn more. I told her we only know 12, and she said, then we'll learn more. She's already decided you're a very interesting person, and she has questions." A pause. "Then, tell Rosie I'm looking forward to meeting someone who has questions. My favorite sign is water, because it's the most peaceful one, hands flowing like a river. Mara." He read that 3 times. "I'm looking forward to meeting her." He looked at Gerald on the windowsill, leaning toward the light. He typed, "We should have dinner. Somewhere I can actually face you when I'm talking. I need the practice, and I think the practice would be better in person." He sent it before he could talk himself into rewording it for 20 minutes. He waited. 6 minutes this time. "Dinner is good. I know a place where the lighting is right, and the tables are far enough apart for a real conversation. I'll send you the address. Friday?" He typed, "Friday is perfect." She sent an address. A restaurant name he recognized, a Thai place near the waterfront that he had walked past but never been into. And then one more message. "Practice the signs before Friday. I'll quiz you." He laughed again. "The real kind." He typed back, "I'm going to fail the quiz." "Probably," she replied, "but your intent is good." Here is what happened in the months after that. Mara and Eli had dinner on Friday. The restaurant she had chosen was smaller and quieter than Luca's, with warm lighting and a server who, when Mara handed over her small card, read it carefully and nodded and spent the whole evening making sure to face her when he spoke, without making a performance of it. The food was good. The conversation was better. Eli's ASL grammar was, as advertised, imperfect. He kept dropping tense markers and occasionally using the wrong classifier. She taught him 3 new signs over dessert: laugh, okay, and future, and he got laugh on the first try and okay on the third, and future not quite that night, but the following week. He was the kind of learner who got things slowly and then had them permanently, which she appreciated. He had enrolled in an intermediate ASL class at the community college before their second dinner. He didn't tell her. She found out when he accidentally used a construction he couldn't possibly have learned from YouTube. She had looked at him, and he had confessed, and she had said nothing, but something in her face had shifted in a way that she hoped he had noticed. He had noticed. He told Mara about Paul, about the 12 years Paul had worked at the firm, about the lunch table, about the Tuesday evening classes at the community center, about what it had cost him, emotionally, to try, and what it had given back. She listened without interrupting. At the end she said, "In sign, Paul sounds like someone who understood that teaching people is a kind of generosity." He thought about that for a long time afterward. 3 months in, Rosie met Mara for the first time. Eli had been careful about this. Rosie was the important one in every calculation. the one he would never get wrong, and he had let her set the pace. Or rather, he had waited to see if she would set a pace, and she had, which was, "When do I get to meet her? Daddy, when do I get to meet her? I've been practicing. Watch." And she would show him another sign she had learned from the app she had downloaded, the signs getting more complex as the weeks went on. He had said, simply, "Saturday if you want, we'll have dinner together." They met at the Thai place where Mara and Eli had had their first dinner, because Rosie had declared this was the obvious choice when Eli mentioned it. She walked in holding his hand and saw Mara waiting at the table and stopped walking for 1 second, just one, and then walked forward and signed, very clearly and without any self-consciousness, "Hello. My name is Rosie. My father taught me. I have been practicing." Mara looked at her hands. Then she looked at Eli. Then she looked back at Rosie. She signed, "Your finger spelling is better than your father's. Much better." Rosie pointed at Eli with an expression of magnificent vindication. "I told you," she said, signing and speaking at once because she had started doing this naturally, the two systems running in parallel, the way languages did in children who were learning them both at once. "I told him I was better. He didn't believe me." "I believed you," Eli said. "You said we'll see," Rosie said. The dinner was 2.5 hours long and covered a range of topics that Rosie considered essential, including but not limited to what music felt like if you could feel the vibration but not the pitch, whether Mara had always been deaf or had become deaf. Always. Mara signed, "I was born this way, it's the only world I know." Whether Mara had ever had a hearing aid. "No," she signed. "Some deaf people choose them, some don't. I never have, and I am very happy with my world." How Mara knew what movies were saying, and whether being deaf made you better at reading faces. Mara answered every question, fully, honestly, without simplifying in the condescending way that adults sometimes simplified things for children, because Rosie was clearly a child who did not appreciate being simplified for. She said that music through vibration was real and full and different, not less. She said captions were one of the best inventions of the last century, and she thought everyone should use them. And she said yes, yes, she was very good at reading faces. "Better than most people?" Rosie asked. "Much better," Mara signed. Rosie looked at her father with the expression of someone who has received important information. "That means she already knows everything about you," she said. Eli looked at Mara over Rosie's head. Mara looked back at him. They did not sign anything. They didn't need to. Mara thought. Sometimes, about that Friday evening at Luca's bistro. She thought about Derek and what he had said, and how she had felt in the restroom running cold water over her wrists. She thought about it without the anger that had been there at the time, the anger that she had folded away so neatly that even she had barely known it was anger until much later. She thought about it as a thing that had happened, a data point in the long catalog of experiences that had made her who she was, and she did not think about it for very long. Mostly she thought about the hands going up, the practiced phrase, the steadiness of being looked at without being assessed, without the quick flicker of calculation that she had learned to see in people's eyes when they learned she was deaf, without the narrowing. She had spent her whole life building things. Her company, her career, her reputation, her life. She had built all of it, with the particular focused energy of someone who knew that nothing would be handed to her, that she would have to make room for herself in every room she entered. She was good at it. She was proud of what she had made. But there was a thing she had not known how to build, a thing she was only beginning to understand could not be built alone, which was the specific experience of not having to make room for yourself, of simply being in a place and being welcome, of having someone turn toward you, not because you had arranged it, but because they wanted to. She was learning, slowly and somewhat awkwardly, how to let that happen. She was not very good at it yet. She still caught herself, sometimes, running the old calculations. Is this sustainable? Is this going to require too much? Is this another person who will be fine for 15 minutes and then forget? She caught herself running those calculations, and she was learning to notice when she was running them, and to put them down gently and see what happened next. So far, what happened next was usually something good. Eli thought, sometimes, about Diane. He thought about her less now in the shape of grief, and more in the shape of everything she had left behind. The daughter who named plants and learned languages overnight and asked questions that were better than most adult questions. The practice of moving toward things. The understanding that seeing something and choosing not to act on it was its own kind of choice, and not the one he wanted to make anymore. He thought about that night at the restaurant, the moment just before he raised his hands, the half a second when he had almost decided not to. He was glad he hadn't. He was still figuring out who he was. He was not done figuring it out. He was not sure you ever were, completely. But he was beginning to understand, the way you understood things slowly, through accumulation, through living, that being a good father and being a full person were not in competition, that he could love Rosie with everything he had and still reach toward something for himself, that there was room. He was learning to believe that. 6 months after that Friday at Luca's Bistro, Eli could hold a real conversation in ASL. His grammar was still not perfect. Mara had a specific expression she made when he got a tense wrong, not quite a wince but in the vicinity, but it was functional and real and improving. He had started going to a deaf social gathering that met on the first Saturday of every month at a coffee shop downtown. He had been welcomed with the warmth and mild amusement of a community that was not used to hearing people showing up and actually doing the work. He had brought Rosie once, with Mara's blessing, and Rosie had been immediately adopted by a group of deaf teenagers who were delighted by her and taught her 6 signs that Eli later had to look up to confirm were appropriate. They were, mostly. Paul, his old co-worker, heard about all of this through mutual acquaintances. He sent a message that said, "I knew you would get there eventually. You always did things the slow and right way." Eli thought that was one of the best things anyone had ever said about him. He told Mara, and she said, "Paul sounds like someone who understood that the slow way is usually the real way." There is one last thing. On a Sunday morning about 8 months after Luca's Bistro, Eli and Rosie and Mara were at a farmer's market near the waterfront. It was May, and Seattle was doing the thing it occasionally did in May, where it forgot to be gray and became, briefly and improbably, golden. The sun was warm in the particular way of Pacific Northwest spring sun, not the aggressive warmth of summer, but gentle, like it was offering rather than insisting. Rosie was at a flower stall, examining sunflowers with the gravity of someone making an important structural decision. She had opinions about each one and was not rushing. A vendor nearby was selling bread, and the smell drifted over, warm and yeasty and good. People moved around them at the comfortable pace of a Sunday market. Mara was standing next to Eli, and they were not talking. They were just standing in the warm morning light, shoulders close, watching Rosie make decisions about sunflowers. Eli looked at Mara. She felt it. She always felt when someone looked at her, some combination of peripheral vision and the slight change in the air, and turned. He raised his hands. He signed, slowly and clearly, the grammar right, the hand shapes correct. "You deserve better." And then, something he had been thinking about for a while, something he had practiced more carefully than anything else he had ever practiced. "I want to be it. For you, if you'll let me." His grammar was correct. He had worked on it. Mara looked at him for a long moment. Her face was doing something she usually kept very carefully managed, something open, something that was entirely her, without the composure she wore in professional rooms or the particular readiness she carried into new situations. Just herself, standing in a Sunday market in the May sun. Her hands came up. She signed, "I know. I can see it. I've been able to see it for a while." He looked at her. She signed, slower, making sure he caught every word. "That's why I left you the note." And then Rosie appeared between them, as Rosie tended to do, at the exact moment of every important conversation, holding a large sunflower in each hand with the expression of someone who had made 2 excellent decisions and was confident in both. "Can we get these?" she signed and said together. "One for the kitchen table, and one for Gerald." Gerald the windowsill plant had, in the past 8 months, grown considerably, been repotted twice, and developed what Rosie considered a very strong personality. He was doing extremely well. She talked to him most mornings. Eli took the sunflowers. He paid for them. Rosie took one back almost immediately. She had changed her mind. She would carry the big one herself, and tucked it under her arm with great confidence. They walked through the market in the May morning sun, the three of them, and it was not a perfect picture, and it was not simple, and there were things in each of their lives that were still complicated and would remain complicated. But it was real, it was full, and standing there in the ordinary golden warmth of a Sunday morning, with sunflowers and a farmer's market, and a 7-year-old announcing that Gerald was going to love this, it was, in every way that mattered, more than enough. It was, in every way that mattered, better.